very important and famous essay with this particular lecture. Now, I just want to move on to the final bit of the essay and just unpack a little bit what Haraway is saying or suggesting over here as prophetic political statements, because I may have mentioned this already, but there is a prophetic quality about this essay in a way that it makes it more relevant to us today than what perhaps was when it was first written in 1984. And it talks about the entanglement between organism and artificiality, man and machine, man and animal, and it's sort of blurring away boundaries between all these categories, these ontological categories, which were reified by humanism, which were sustained by humanism, in the sense of making it hierarchical. So, in the discourse of humanism, for instance, classical, Eurocentric, dominant modes of humanism, man, the male, was always the center of the entire discursive activity. And obviously the binary of the male center was female, and of course the male center was a white male center, so it was heavily racialized as well. So racialization was part of the reification process. So with that as a center, all the other stuff in the margins became the others in different degrees of otherness. So woman was one very convenient other, the non-white man, the non-white woman, the beast, the animal, the machine. So all these were conveniently othered at different points of historical time. But with the rise of the cyborg, which is sort of an evolution, if you will, in late 20th century technocratic capitalism, these binaries, or these mapping outs, become quite sort of entangled with each other. So no longer can we talk about the female and the male as separate entities. With the rise of biotechnology, with the rise of sex change operations and surgeries, these distinctions are getting increasingly blurred away. Man-animal, man-machine, organism, inorganism, organism and machine. So all these categories which were conveniently mapped out and conveniently demarcated in the discourses of humanism had been, are now being done away with the rise of the cyborg. So this is what Haraway is contending throughout this essay, and she's arguing, interestingly, and what is also interesting is to understand that the attitude that Haraway takes towards these kind of doing away with reifications, these kind of deconstructions. She's not mourning the loss of the original centers. She's not mourning the loss of the original ontological orders. She's rather acknowledging, accepting, and perhaps celebrating that kind of decimation of boundaries. And this is a very postmodernist thing to do. So this is one of the reasons why this particular text is taught heavily, is anthologized heavily in the syllabi of postmodernism, as well as the syllabi of feminism across the world in different departments. So this is very much a postmodernist feminism, or a postmodernist feminist perspective into the entire idea of the body, identity, embodiment, consumption, etc. So the final bit of the essay, which we will cover today, Haraway talks about the consequences, the fallout, if you will, of taking the cyborg imagery seriously. So what are the political possibilities that might emerge from taking the cyborg imagery seriously? What are the sort of epistemic possibilities, the political possibilities, the cultural possibilities which can emerge out of acknowledging the cyborg as a potent presence, as a palpable, potent presence, as a reality in the world we internalize and inhabit today. So this is what she says, and this should be on your screen. There are several consequences to taking seriously the imagery of cyborgs as other than our enemies. So she's saying that, if we just stop for a moment othering the cyborg as the enemy, as the alternative, as the the other, the alterity, the fearful other. If we do away with the idea of the fearful other, and if we acknowledge the cyborg as part of our existence, as very much who we are, not as something outside of ourselves, but as something which we have become, in the current culture of consumption, the current culture of technocratic capitalism, etc. If we can do that, there are some very serious consequences which can emerge out of that acceptance, and these consequences are not necessarily negative. They can be profoundly positive. They can have pretty positive political ramifications. In what way? And this is what Haraway goes on to say. Our bodies, ourselves, bodies are maps of power and identity. So it's a very Foucauldian understanding of the body, which is extended and sort of extremely extended by Haraway over here, when she talks about bodies as maps of power and identity, because bodies are articulations of power, bodies are performances of power and identity. So if you look at the phrase that she's using, the vocabulary that she's using is very much a vocabulary of machines, or machinery vocabulary. So she's talking about bodies, the entire organic quality of the body as some kind of a mapped machine which produces and promotes and disseminates, dispenses power and identity. So it's a bit of a power-making machine, an identity-producing machine. It's like a vending machine for power and identity. The way we perform, the way we carry ourselves, the way our embodiment maps onto certain discursive spaces. Cyborgs are no exception. A cyborg body is not innocent. It was not born in a garden. It does not seek unitary identity and so generate antagonistic dualisms without end or until the world ends. It takes irony for granted. Now, this is getting more and more postmodern, as you can understand. So the non-innocence of cyborg is something which is highlighted, acknowledged and celebrated by Haraway. So the cyborg is not innocent. It was not born in a garden, so there's no biblical story of origin that one can associate with the cyborg. As you may remember, at the very beginning of the essay, Haraway very provocatively says that if we still continue to consume and teach and indoctrinate children the entire biblical story of creation, with Adam and Eve's story, that particular narrative, that should be considered as child abuse. Teaching a child that kind of fiction, I mean, a very, very regressive fiction, according to Haraway. So a very provocative sentence that teaching the creation narrative to children should be considered, should be counted as child abuse in today's world, is something that she's reiterating away up when she's saying that the cyborg body is not innocent, is a very, very polymorphous, non-innocent body, and it was not born in the Garden of Eden, and more importantly, it does not seek a unitary identity. So it doesn't really aspire for any kind of unification at the end. So there is no union out of which it is born, there is no union into which it seeks to end. So there's no linear temporal narrative in which the cyborg wants to map itself onto. So it takes irony for granted. Now, irony, of course, is a very, very important instrument. It's one of the key instruments of postmodernism. Irony is that particular strategy, that particular performance by which you say something and mean something else. So that semantic slipperiness, if you will, that is what constitutes irony, and that's one of the key things in postmodernism, that semantic slipperiness, that play between superficiality and depth, that play between the center and centerlessness. So irony constitutes all of that. Now, the cyborg takes irony for granted. It becomes embedded with irony. It's an instrument of irony. It's a performance of irony. It's something which is embedded inside the cyborg's embodiment. One is too few, and two is only one possibility. Intense pleasure is skill. Machine skill ceases to be a sin, but an aspect of embodiment. So pleasure becomes an aspect of embodiment. Now, contrast that to the idea of embodiment as a productive function, which was a pre-postmodern mode of embodiment, that embodiment needs to be productive, and embodiment needs to produce something, subscribe to something, conform to something. Now, contrast to that, we have the cyborg embodiment as a playful activity, as a ludic activity, something which may or may not conform to a larger structure of things, a larger narrative of things, a larger architecture of meaning. So it doesn't conform, it doesn't necessarily conform to a larger architecture of meanings. So in that sense, embodiment, play becomes, so the ludic possibility of embodiment becomes highlighted or foregrounded when it comes to the cyborg. The machine is not an it to be animated, worshipped and dominated. The machine is us, our processes, an aspect of our embodiment. So this is again one of the important things which this essay does. It blurs away the borderline between the inside and the outside. So it says the machine is not something out there to be consumed, to be dictated, to be worshipped, to be fed with data, with information, with orders. It is us. It is what we have become. It is what we imagine ourselves to be. It is part of our embodiment. It's ingrained in our organic bodies. So this is us, our machine. We are machines in the world today. So we are essentially becoming more and more cyborgian in quality. And that brings us obviously to some of the very important aspects of embodiment today, whereby we are looking at a more distributive order of embodiment, a more fluid order of embodiment, in contrast to static models of embodiment which preceded postmodernism. So the machine is us, our processes, an aspect of our embodiment. We can be responsible for machines. They do not dominate or threaten us. We are responsible for boundaries. We are they. So again, we are looking at a complete blurring of borderlines between us and them, machines and man. And that's something that Haraway had talked about already at the beginning of the essay, where she said that there are three distinctions which are done away with the rise of the cyborg. And one of those distinctions, one of the key distinctions, was the man-machine binary. That has been completely done away with. We're looking at, instead of a binary, instead of a dualism, we're looking at an entanglement, an intersocial relationship between man and machine. And in that sense, we are responsible for boundaries. We are they. We are machines. Up until now, once upon a time, female embodiment seemed to be given organic necessary, and female embodiment seemed to mean skill in mothering and its metaphoric extension. Now, if you look at the sort of tongue-in-cheek style of the rhetoric over here, when she says once upon a time, so that's almost a time of fantasy, a time of some kind of a timeless, fantastic past, where Haraway is saying that, in that time of fantastic past, or the past of fantasy, female embodiment meant mothering, meant nurturing, meant giving birth, meant that domestic, intimate activities. That was the be-all and end-all of any kind of embodiment related to the feminine self, and it included skill in mothering. So the only skill set which were aspired out of female embodiment were a skill set in mothering, nurturing. That was once upon a time. There was one time of the fantastic past. Now, only by being out of place could we take intense pleasure in machines, and then with excuses that this was an organic activity after all, appropriate to females. Cyborgs might consider more seriously the partial, fluid, sometimes aspect of sex and sexual embodiment. Gender might not be global identity after all, even if it has profound historical breadth and depth. Now, partiality, fluidity, and polymorphous activity, these become very important categories, very important functional categories of the cyborg. And if you look at the sentence over here, sometimes aspect of sex and sexual embodiment. So sometimes aspect, the incomplete aspect, temporally incomplete, sometimes. That aspect of embodiment, that aspect of sexual embodiment. So those become important with the rise of the cyborg model of embodiment. So if we contrast that to the humanist order of embodiment, more specifically female embodiment, which was entirely sort of premised on mothering, nurturing, life-giving, etc., these activities, we move away from that, and now we take intense pleasure in machines. So embodiment becomes a playful activity, a pleasurable activity. Now, of course, one can and perhaps should connect this to some of the important works which are done in French feminism, for instance, the three big names in French feminism, Irigaray, Kixu, Graceva. All of them talk about the entire idea of play, entire idea of pleasure. Pleasure as a function which doesn't need to be functional, pleasure as a function which doesn't need to be productive in its possibilities, pleasure as an inward-looking narcissistic activity which may or may not produce anything after all. So pleasure as a non-productive activity, as a ludic activity, as an ironic activity. So that kind of activity was celebrated by the French feminists, and obviously Haraway seems to align herself attitudinally with that kind of embodiment principle. And of course, this is quite post-structuralist as well, where if you look at the post-structuralist idea of writing, for instance, which were theorized by people like Roland Barthes, where he had talked about the entire idea of the writerly text as a text of jouissance, which is writing as a pleasurable activity, writing as a pleasure-producing activity, which may or may not mean anything, which may or may not end up being productive in a non-pleasure sense. So the only responsibility, the only aspiration that such writing has is to be pleasurable in quality. It's to give pleasure, attain pleasure, being absorbed in pleasure. So pleasure becomes a subversive function, as you can imagine by now. And that kind of a subversive category is something which is highlighted by Haraway as well, especially when she's talking about the idea of cyborg embodiment. Okay? So the ideologically charged question of what counts as daily activity as experience can be approached by exploiting the cyborg image. So, exploiting doesn't become a bad activity after all. So exploiting is appropriating. So if you appropriate a cyborg image, then of course we can sort of problematize and re-ontologize things such as daily activity, experience, etc. Right? So a cyborg image can be exploited, a cyborg image can be appropriated, and that act of appropriation, that act of exploitation can re-problematize and re-ontologize what we take for granted, what we consume as a daily activity. So dailiness can be problematized and re-ontologized with the appropriation of the cyborg image. Feminists have recently claimed that women are given to dailiness, that women, more than men, somehow sustain daily life and so have a privileged epistemological position potentially. So if we're looking at re-ontologizing dailiness, which is a very political thing to do, as you can imagine, that the entire idea of dailiness, as we consume it, sometimes unconsciously, as we internalize unconsciously, if that dailiness is defamiliarized or de-ontologized, then obviously women can have a privileged epistemological position because they are more, historically they have been suffering dailiness, they have been absorbed into dailiness much more than men. So that position can now be used as a position of privilege, that position of suffering, that position of liquidation, if you will, that can be now considered or reclassified as a position of privilege, because then they have an insider's insight into what dailiness is, and that insight can then be used, can then inform this entire activity of re-ontologization, of problematizing dailiness, making dailiness into some kind of a subversive activity, right? So there is a compelling aspect to this claim, one that makes visible unvalued female activity and names it as the ground of life. So what is the unvalued female activity? The unvalued female activity is activity at home, the activity of the intimate space where people just take it for granted, the activity of nurturing, mothering, caregiving, etc. So those activities which are expected of females, which are unwaged labor, by the way. If you look at it from a Marxist perspective, no one pays them, they're not paid for that activity. It's just something which is expected of them as a virtue narrative. So that kind of an activity can be re-ontologized, can be problematized with the rise of a cyborg embodiment. And then she talks about the entire idea of the last image, the organisms and the organismistic holistic politics depending on metaphors of rebirth. So we come to the end of the essay where she talks about the metaphorical possibilities of the cyborg, and she says, and this should be on the screen, I would suggest that cyborgs have more to do with regeneration and are suspicious of the reproductive matrix and of most birthing. So reproduction is replaced by regeneration. Now if we see the difference between the two words, if you remember the two the two maps which were offered by Haraway, which is something we discussed in the last lecture. So reproduction has more of an organic quality about it. It's more organic, it's almost divine. There's a degree of divinity, there's a degree of, of course it's a physical activity, but there's a metaphysical essence to reproduction in the sense that, there's a degree of holiness to it. And if you compare that with regeneration, which is sometimes, more often than not, more artificial in quality, and that's something which is foregrounded, by the cyborgs. So they have more to do with the regeneration rather than reproduction. They're suspicious of reproduction. For salamanders, it's a kind of reptile, for salamanders, regeneration after injury, such as a loss of a limb, involves regrowth of structure and restoration of function, with the constant possibility of twinning or other topographical productions at the site of former injury. The regrown limb can be monstrous, duplicated, potent. We have all been injured profoundly. We require regeneration, not rebirth, and the possibilities of our reconstitution include the utopian dream or the hope of a monstrous world without gender. Now, again, notice the way in which monstrosity becomes not just an accepted category, but a coveted category, rather, over here. Because, and the reference to the salamander is interesting, because what that reference does is that it tells us that our location as a primate is not really a privileged location. We need to move away from the position of this privileged location, this privileged perspective, and we need to look at ourselves as co-inhabitants. So we are sharers of this ecosystem, and salamanders, men, other primates, other animals, they all become sharers or subscribers or co-consumers, if you will, of the same ecosystem. So the move away from this anthropocentric perspective is important. And so the reference over here to salamanders involves that move away from anthropocentrism. And she says quite interestingly that, in the case of a salamander, the loss of a limb involves regrowth or regeneration, but the new limb or the new tissue which comes at the point of the old limb can be monstrous in quality. And why monstrous? It's monstrous because it may appear as an aberration. It may appear as a break of the norm. It may appear as some kind of a physiognomic aberration, something of an excessive quality, something of a non-normative quality. And now she connects that to the cyborg imagery, where she says in the end, at this point, that we require regeneration, not rebirth. So regeneration is more coveted than rebirth, according to Haraway, according to the cyborg perspective narrative that she's taking, offering. And then she says the possibilities of a reconstitution include the utopian dream of the hope of a monstrous world without gender. So the monstrous world is a world of hope. So we can aspire for a monstrous world, and that monstrous world will be one without gender, without a binary of gender, without a binaristic, without a dualism of gender, without a dual discourses of gender. And that, of course, is a utopian dream that, of course, becomes a coveted category according to Haraway's narrative. Right, so what can the cyborg imagery, lastly, this is a sort of summing up bit, what can a cyborg imagery teach us? What can, what didactic function can it perform in a world we live in today? Cyborg imagery can help express two crucial arguments in this essay. First, the production of a universal totalizing theory is a major mistake, and that misses most of reality, probably always, but certainly now. And second, taking responsibility for the social relations of science and technology means refusing an anti-science metaphysics, a demonology of technology, and so means embracing the skillful task of reconstructing the boundaries of daily life in partial connection with others, in communication with all of our parts. So these are two important aspects that cyborg imagery can help articulate and help underline. So first is any idea, any attempt for a totalizing universal theory is a mistake, because that can become a grand narrative very quickly, and that grand narrative can take up a hegemonic quality, which then will assume a center, and the center margin thing will be replicated, and that will become a very inconvenient tool which will legitimize discrimination, which will legitimize exploitation, which will legitimize domination in a world that has always happened, in a way that's always happened in the history of humanity. If you talk about imperialism, if you talk about racism, they've all had this kind of a dualistic discourse and an idea of a universal totalizing theory. So any attempt to sort of create or make an architecture of a totalizing universal theory is a mistake, because that misses reality, that misses a lived reality of everydayness. And secondly, the idea of move away from some kind of a Eurocentric scientific technology, move away from a dominant capitalist scientific technology, and using that against itself can help us understanding, help us experiencing partial connection with others. So we need to have a reconstituted idea of kinship. We need to have a reconstituted idea of embodiment. We need to have a reconstructed idea of boundaries in life. So the boundaries of life should be done away with, should be reformulated, should be restructured. And that restructuring will emerge as a partial connection with others. And again, look at the word partial. It's never a complete connection. That it's not even coveted. So the partial connection becomes the authentic connection, the true connection. So any true connection can only be partial in quality, can only be incomplete in quality, can only be interstitial in quality. And that interstitiality, the partiality, are things which are not hidden, which are not concealed in the cyborg narrative, but which are foregrounded and celebrated in the cyborg narrative. So in communication with all of our parts, it is not just that science and technology are possible means of great human satisfaction, as well as a matrix of complex dominations. Cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualism, so that maze of dualisms can be escaped with the cyborg imagery, can be done away with the cyborg imagery. And that dualism in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves. So that self-explanatory dualism, which is historically informed scientific knowledge, can be done away with, can be escaped, can be subverted with the cyborg imagery. This is a dream not of a common language, but of a powerful infidel heteroglossia. And this is a very, very important word, infidel. It's not a fiddle. It's not a faithful language. It's a language which is essentially a bastard language, an illegitimate language. But that bastard quality, that illegitimate quality, is something which is celebrated in that kind of a discourse. Heteroglossia is a Bakhtinian term, Mikhail Bakhtin. Many languages, many voices, polyphony of languages come together, put together. So we don't really aspire for a common language. We aspire for a heteroglossic language, a language which is mixed, mutable, messy. And that becomes an infidel language, a powerful infidel language. So infidelity obviously becomes a category for celebration, something which is coveted, a coveted category. It's an imagination of a feminist speaking in tongues to strike fear into the circuits of the super saviors of the new right. It means both building and destroying machines, identities, categories, relationships, space stories. Though both are bound in a spiral dance, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. So that preference is articulated in the end. Should rather be a cyborg than a goddess, moving on from the humanist principle and into the postmodern principle of artificiality, which is celebrated and acknowledged. So the move away from goddess is obviously move away from humanism, which is articulated clearly at the end of the essay. So we end the lecture with this at this point. That concludes the Cyborg Manifesto. We'll move on to a new text in our next lecture. Thank you for your attention.